Welcome to Scary Stories Volume 2, read by Mekhi Molina. Story 1. My dog is sick and is scaring the hell out of me. I, F21, have a dog, Max, M2, who is diagnosed with distemper, and he's scaring the hell out of me. Last Friday evening, when I arrived from work, I was greeted by a quiet house. This was odd, given that Max would always scurry to the front of the house as soon as the latch unhitched. His panting excitement and joyous demeanor are always a welcome sight after a hard day's work, and I always look forward to his loving embrace. Today, however, the house was at a standstill. Only the humming of the fridge and the occasional beep of an unchanged fire alarm battery were audible. "Max?" I called out, but my calls went unanswered. I settled my key into the bowl on my kitchen counter and cautiously made my way through the dimly lit house, half expecting Max to jump out at any moment. He'd made it a game to stalk me from the shadows in recent weeks, always jumping out in the least expected moment, startling the hell out of me. I peered around every doorway, making sure that Max was not lying in wait. But he never pounced. Looking around the doorframe of my bedroom, I saw a silhouetted figure nestled cozy in the dog bed by my footboard. "Max?" I called out once again, stirring the figure out of its slumber. Max raised his head and rested his snout on the crest of the dog bed, his ears looking more like horns in the soft moonlight emanating from the window. The light ignited the lucidum in the back of his eye sockets. "Come here, boy." The dog stammered to his feet and took a few steps toward me. By then I could tell something was wrong. Max's steps were strangely uncoordinated. Taking one step, he crossed the next awkwardly around the last, and always hesitating to inch forward. When he stepped under the shine of the moonlight, I could see him shivering. His tail raised, but he could not wag. Instead, his torso wriggled in his attempt to show his happiness. Once he made it into my arms, I cradled him tight as he rested his head against my chest. Not a moment after, he vomited all over the floor and his body went limp. I panicked. Scooping him off the floor, I rushed him to the car and sped off to the emergency animal hospital. Once there, I placed my best friend in the care of the hospital staff. I was unable to follow them to the back and could only worry in the waiting room while I awaited Max's fate. "Miss Chansey," a nurse called out. I shot to my feet and hastily made my way over to the door she held propped open. She greeted me with a warm smile and assured me that my friend was stable and in good spirits, but the vet wanted to discuss a few things with me. I was led to a small closet-like room where Max rested atop an examination table. I couldn't help but crush him to death in my relief. His tail finally wagged and he gazed at me through his yellow discharge in his eyes. I heard the door was closed behind me. A man wearing a light white lab coat and touting a somber expression stood awaiting my response. I gave a forced smile and he finally spoke. "Miss Chansey, please take a seat." I obliged. "I have some good and bad news to share with you." My heart dropped at the mention of those words. I slumped back into one of the chairs of the perimeter of the exam room. "We've run some tests on Max here, and there isn't any good way to say this, but he's tested positive for distemper. Are you familiar with that term? I nod my head in the negative. "Well, distemper is a viral infection that can infect animals in the canine family. It is a serious infection that affects the animal's central nervous system, and if survived, can have lifelong implications on dogs." If survived, I think to myself, but was unable to physically pose the question. My face must have dropped from my dismay because the man expanded on the survival rate. Distemper typically has a survival rate of about 50% in adult dogs, but there is a silver lining. We caught it early, and through medication we'll be able to treat some of the more serious effects of the virus. A mild sense of relief washed over me. But there are never any guarantees with such a virus as this. You must give Max the regimented doses of his medication to ensure the best possible outcome. After a long night at the hospital, Max and I were finally on our way home. Max was curled up into a ball in the passenger seat, eyeing me lovingly through his tormenting condition. I, however, was extremely tired. and could hardly keep my eyes on the road. Not to mention the anxiety that ate away at me throughout the night. I always clenched in worry. My body felt like I had just ran a marathon. Rolling onto the driveway, the tires gave a familiar crunch of gravel pressing against the tires. Max raised his head to inspect his surroundings. My heart warmed to see my friend's tail waving in joyousness. Putting the car in park, I walked over to Max's side of the car and carried him inside, his movements still being sporadic. I couldn't leave him to make the walk myself. Making our way through the house, we reached my bedroom. I gently placed Max in my comforter and plopped down beside him, drifting off into a deep, restful sleep. The afternoon sun hit the side of my face. Strange given that I distinctly remember closing the blinds before nodding off. I reached over to cuddle Max, but to my surprise he was not where I left him. I shot up and called out, "Max!" I heard footsteps coming from down the hall, along with the scratching of nails on the wooden floor. It filled my heart to hear my friend finally be able to do more on his own accord. I did not move to aid my friend. I wanted to see him walk in triumphantly, to know that he was getting better. My eyes planted on the bottom right corner of the door. I patiently awaited his arrival. His snout stepped into view, but it was stationed a lot higher than where my eyes were focused. 2 more scraping steps, and I jumped back in fear. Max had walked bipedally into the center of the doorframe. With 2 more slow steps, he disappeared behind the opposite side of the frame. Max? Too afraid to go see where the human-like canine had gone, I stationed myself behind my comforter. Suddenly, his snout appeared from the left side of the frame, this time hobbling into view as a normal distempered dog. Confused and relieved, I awaited Max atop the bed, scooting him up when he reached my bed frame. I looked at Max back over to the left side of the doorframe where I had just seen him disappear. My skin pimpled in fear, but I was snapped out of it when Max looked at the underside of my chin. I dismissed the occurrence as a hallucination summoned by lack of sleep and returned my attention to the dog in my arms, planting a loving peck on his forehead. I swore I saw Max wince at my touch, but that was pushed out of my mind. I was just so happy he was getting better. Later that night, Max and I were lounging on the couch, and the TV blared the sounds of our favorite comfort show. I had not left my friend alone all day. I was scared that if I somehow lost sight of him, he would take a turn for the worse. So he was always within eyesight. My phone alarm went off, along with a reminder I had scheduled. Give Max his meds, plastered across the phone's notification banner. Max gave a twist of his neck, acknowledging what the sound had signified in the past few hours. He gave a slow tail wag at the realization that a piece of broken hot dog was coming his way. To his ignorance, a few pills were shoved deep inside the deli meat. I patted him on the brow and rocked forward, propelling myself out of the seat. Max attempted to follow, but I saw him slump back into the couch cushion, appearing almost as if he'd been hit by a quick bout of vertigo. He whimpered at his inability. "It's okay, Max. I'll be right back with your treat." I comforted as his ears perked at the mention of the word treat. Warmth washes across my heart to see him happy. I scurried off to the kitchen, Max always within view. I prepped his next dose, pulling the pill bottles out of the kitchen drawer, counting the dosage, and opening the fridge to get the long-awaited hot dog. As I opened the fridge and the cold air hit my face, I briefly lost sight of Max behind the door. "Max, almost ready," I called as I shut the door and returned my attention to the furball on the sofa. I dropped the meat on the floor in shock. Max had disappeared. In his normal state, Max was fast and quiet, not out of the realm of possibility to think he could dart off so fast, but in his current condition it took him a few minutes to navigate through my small 2-bedroom home. "Max?" I yelled. I could not hide my worry, and I started to hyperventilate. "Max, where are you?" Running over to the living room where I had just left the sickly dog, pushing over couch pillows as though I could hide a large lap behind their size. When you love something, all reasons tends to go by the wayside. "Max!" I whimpered, just as I plowed one of the pillows onto the floor. I heard the squirmy sound of something soft and fleshy being crushed behind me. My head swiveled at lightning speed, and I let out a yelp. Max was standing on his hind legs, back paw pressing down on the falling hot dog. His back was erect in a very human S-shaped orientation, unlike the straight, rigid back of a normal quadruped. His front paw reached over for the latch on the floor. To my horror, his fingers were sickeningly dexterous. As the fridge light shone on his face, he bent over, and I swear I heard a very manly groan as he rummaged through my food stores. Max stood straight once again and turned his snout in my direction. Several pieces of uncooked bacon clenched in his jaws. I was shaking. My knees were locked. I wanted to call out Max, but I could not do so. Max looked me up and down, and for a second we were locked in a visual battle. He eventually let me win, dropping down to all fours. He ungracefully made his way back to the couch, regaining his favorite spot. I fell onto the farthest spot on the sectional for Max. As he gnawed on his pork strips, I could not break my line of sight with him. He must have noticed because he raised his gaze toward me. I averted my stare as if he were a stranger who caught me ogling him in public. I heard him go back to chewing on his bacon, and for the rest of the evening I could only side-eye him in uneasiness. It was time for bed, and since the situation with the fridge occurred, I debated making Max sleep on the couch. But despite the strange behavior, I could not leave him. At the very least, he could sleep in his dog bed on the far side of the room. Max fragilely trotted into the bedroom and gave me a quick glance as he noticed his bed in a strange position. I felt like I was being guilt-tripped by a furry, judgmental human. But he accepted his fate and walked over to the nest, curling into a little ball. I was half expecting him to fight me on this, but he seemed non-combative, like he was giving me a dismissive brush. I turned off the lamp and tried to close my eyes, but I felt too uneasy at Max's presence to let the night wash over me. On occasion, I would peer over at Max and see his eyes shining on me through the moonlight. Around midnight, I finally heard the familiar sound of Max's snore and felt some sense of quiet relief. I managed to drift off into a restful slumber. That is, until I woke to the sound of TV piercing the quiet night. I sat up searching for Max in the corner of the room, but he was gone. Down the hall, I could tell that Tom and Jerry was playing on the late-night cartoon channel. Max loved to watch Tom and Jerry. His ear would stand at the scene where the cat would give the mouse chase, and I could almost hear him huff at the comedic sight of the cat's frustration when he failed at catching Tom. Tonight, however, there was a maniacal cackle at the orchestra's crescendo and Tom's screams. I shuffled my way down the hall and was met with the sight of Max sitting on his haunches atop the sectional. Tom's head was crushed by a mallet, and Max's mouth gaped open in laughter. I must have gasped because the dog quickly faced his head in my direction. He took to his hind legs and started running at me. I dashed down the hall and locked myself in the bathroom. He's knocking at the door and I don't know what to do. If I call the police, they'll think I'm crazy. Animal control might be called in and they could take Max away forever. Crazy as it sounds, I don't want my friend to be put down. Even if he's not well, he can get better. He must get better. I'm asking for advice. What do I do? I can't lose Max. He's my best friend, but I don't want him to murder me either. Should I just jump out the window and abandon my friend? Or should I open the door and see what comes of this? P.S. He is now calling my name from the other side of the door. Story number 2. The Scarecrow. When I was a kid, we lived in a remote, forgotten corner of the countryside, the kind of place people drive through without ever realizing it's inhabited, just a gas station and a few rundown shops, swallowed by endless fields. My parents chose this place for reasons I never understood. They worked themselves into early graves, tolling in our cornfields that stretched out forever, disappearing into the horizon. As a child, there was something almost magical about the isolation. But as I grew older, the magic curled into resentment. My sisters and I had driven an hour west just to get to school, and the day we all left home for good was a liberation. But even more than the isolation, what drove me away was my father's obsession with the scarecrows. He planted them everywhere. Every inch of our miles-long fields were dotted with them. I never understood how he managed it, but I swear there wasn't a patch of ground without one of those grotesque figures. They were unlike any scarecrows I have ever seen. Even now, as an adult, I get chills remembering them. They had an eerie realism to them, a grotesque hyper-detail that made your skin crawl. Their faces were twisted into expressions that seemed almost human. Eyes that bulged unnervingly, lips contorted in silent screams, and their bodies. They didn't stand on poles like normal scarecrows. They were crucified. Their heads hung low, arms spread too wide, legs crossed unnaturally. From their midsection, hay spilled out like entrails, and their long matted hair dripped black as if soaked in oil. My father claimed it was just mops he dipped in paint, but even as a kid, that explanation never sat right with me. I was in my second year at the University of Michigan when I got a call from my mother. My father was dead. The news hit me like a punch to the gut, cold fear trickling down my spine. I listened to my mother's voice crackle through the phone, the words barely registering. But in that moment, all I could think about were those scarecrows. I imagined my father strung up like one of them, crucified in his own field. I shook the image from my mind, chalking it up to grief, to the shock of losing him. My mother pleaded with us to come home for the funeral. Reluctantly, we agreed, but the day before my flight, my sister called me. Her voice was hushed, trembling, as if speaking too loud might awaken something. She needed to tell me something she'd kept buried for years. I asked if she'd spoken to our other sister, but she had said that when she was tried, she was shut down, told to never mention it again. With a shaky breath, she began to tell me her secret. As she spoke, goosebumps prickled my skin. Back in high school, she'd been looking for a place to throw a party, trying to impress some boy. She remembered an old abandoned farm our father used when he still raised cattle, a few miles out from our house. One night she drove out there, thinking everyone at home was asleep. She slipped through the side door, and what she saw has haunted her ever since. She found our father on his knees before an impossibly tall man. The figure's face was shrouded, its hands engulfing our father's face, fingers long and bony, stretching around his skull like a grotesque cage. She thought, though she couldn't be sure, that the thing's head was a swollen, oversized pumpkin, distorted and bulging in ways that shouldn't be possible. They were chanting something low, guttural murmur in a language she didn't recognize. Before she could process what she was seeing, she heard rustling all around her. Panic seized her, and she bolted away from the car, driving its way as fast as she could. As she fled, she caught glimpses of her tall figures lurking at edges of the road, and every mile she drove, the scarecrows seemed to turn to follow her. When she got home, she hid under her covers until morning. She told our other sister about it once, but was met with ridicule and told to never speak of it again. She buried it until now. The phone call from our mother had unearthed it all, and she was terrified that the scarecrows, or whatever they represented, had something to do with our father's death. Her voice cracked into a manic laugh as she told me, saying how ridiculous she sounded, but I could hear the fear behind her voice. She begged me to convince our mother to come to us instead, to avoid going back to that house. Despite how insane it all sounded, I believed her. There was always something wrong with their scarecrows, something unnatural. I called our other sister, telling her everything, urging her to convince our mother to leave that place and never look back, but she lashed out at me, calling us both paranoid. She threatened to cut us out of her life if we didn't come home for the funeral. I was scared, but I didn't want to lose my sister over it. I began to wonder if maybe we were just being paranoid. Our sister did have a history with psychedelics, after all. Maybe it was just some hallucination. I tried to convince myself it was all in our heads, a trick of the mind, but deep down I knew better. The night before my flight, I had a nightmare. I found myself in the middle of a cornfield, the stalks towering above me, hemming me in. The sky was a vivid, unnatural blue, too perfect to be real. A trail of red powder stretched before me, leading me on for what felt like hours. Eventually, I reached a clearing, a circle of dead stalks. In the center stood a single stake, a lone scarecrow tied to it. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a scarecrow at all. It was a man, dressed in the ragged clothes of one. I felt a force behind me, unseen hands pushing me towards the figure. As I approached, a dread coiled in my gut, and as I saw the scarecrow's face, it was my own. Suddenly, I felt long, spindly fingers wrap around my shoulders, and I jolted awake, drenched in sweat. I glanced at the clock late. I scrambled out the door, catching an Uber to the airport just in time. The flight home was a blur of anxiety and unease. By the time I reached our house, night had finally fully settled in. I sat in the car, staring at the darkened windows, my heart pounding as I tried to gather up the courage to go inside. The house loomed before me, shadows creeping up its walls, giving it an almost sinister presence. When I finally stepped through the front door, the heavy silence enveloped me like a shroud. Everyone was inside, my sisters and my mother, but there was something terribly off. My mother looked different. She was gaunt, her skin stretched tight over her bones, and her hair was thin, falling out in clumps. Dark circles hollowed her eyes, which darted nervously, as if seeing things the rest of us couldn't. I asked her what had happened, but she didn't give me a strange look, a mix of confusion and annoyance. "I just need some rest," she murmured, her voice distant, like she was speaking through a fog. My sisters exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't our mother. She'd always been such a strong, sharp woman, but now she seemed like a hollow shell of herself. Trying to piece together what was going on, I hesitantly asked about our father. I expected to hear that he was at the morgue, but her answer still sent a chill down my spine. "He's tucked away somewhere safe," she said with a flat, emotionless tone. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. My sisters and I stared at each other, alarmed. Something was very wrong. Our mother, seeming almost irritated by our concern, abruptly decided she was tired and wanted to go to bed. She shuffled off to her room without another word. My oldest sister tried to downplay it, suggesting that maybe she was just in shock. She excused herself to her old bedroom, leaving me and my other sister alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the oppressive silence of the house. I put on a pot of coffee, knowing neither of us would be able to sleep that night. We tried to distract ourselves, talking about funny memories from our childhood. She told me about the time she broke into an animal shelter to rescue a dog that was already lined up for a home, and I recounted the embarrassing story of how I got into my frat. Somehow, as the night wore on, we ended up finding one of Dad's old liquor cabinets and spiking our coffee with whiskey. We played childish pranks on each other, laughing more than we had in years, but beneath it all, there was a tension, a fear we couldn't shake. Eventually, the conversation drifted back to the night she saw. Hesitantly, I asked if she remembered taking any drugs, maybe shrooms or something. She shook her head, her eyes haunted. I was sober," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I hadn't touched anything in months." She didn't want to talk about it anymore, and I didn't push. We ended up falling asleep on the couch. On midnight, the unease settling over us like a blanket. I woke up suddenly with a pounding headache. The clock read 5 in the morning, but it was still pitch dark outside. Winter in this part of the country meant the sun wouldn't rise for another hour, and sometimes it felt like it never came up at all. I stumbled to the bathroom, my footsteps echoing in the silent house. As I stood there, I felt a sudden chill, a cold so sharp it cut through the whiskey fog in my head. I spun around, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing, just shadows. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I walked back to the living room, but my sister was gone. I assumed she must have gone to her old bedroom to sleep more comfortably, so I decided to do the same. But when I entered my room, I noticed the window was wide open. The freezing night air rushed in, biting at my skin. As I moved close to it, something outside caught my eye, and my blood ran cold. There, near the edge of the cornfield, I saw my sister standing, her figure illuminated by the dim moonlight. She was staring into the dark rows of corn as if contemplating stepping inside. I whispered her name, hoping to catch her attention without waking anyone else, but she didn't respond. I grabbed a pen from my desk and tossed it toward her, missing completely, but the slight noise made her turn her head. Just a fraction, I saw her face. Blank and distant, her eyes were locked on something unseen. A sickening fear gripped me, rooting me in place. My legs felt heavy, paralyzed by a dread I couldn't fully understand. I knew I had to help her, but I couldn't move. I forced myself to turn away and crept to our other sister's room, whispering her name. No response. I called a little louder, but still. She didn't stir. This was strange. She was always such a light sleeper. I reached out to shake her awake, and as I touched her shoulder, she rolled over. As she rolled over, I recoiled in horror. Her face was horrifyingly disfigured, shriveled and sunken like a dried-out husk. Her eyes were hollow pits, her mouth agape in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, in my own scream clawing at my throat. What was this? What had happened to her? I started pinching myself, praying to wake up from this nightmare, but nothing changed. Panic surged through me as I remembered my mother. I ran to her room, every instinct my body screaming at me to stop, to turn back, but I pushed on. When I burst into her room, I saw her standing by the window, staring out into the darkness, her posture unnaturally stiff. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge me at all. My heart pounded in my ears as I took a step closer, my voice barely a whisper. Mom! She didn't move. She just kept staring out into the night, and then, in a voice that wasn't hers, a voice cold and empty, she spoke. They're waiting for us. Chills ran down my spine. I could barely force out a few words. I asked her, "Who?" But she didn't turn around. She just kept staring out into the night, unmoving, her body stiff, unnatural. That was when I knew I had to get out of there. Whatever was left of my family was gone, replaced by something unrecognizable, something inhuman. I was alone now, and I had to escape before whatever had gotten them had taken me too. I bolted from the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back as I sprinted to my rental car, fumbling with the keys in a panic. As soon as I got the door open, I jumped in, started the engine, and sped off into the darkness, the house disappearing in my rearview mirror. A month has passed since that night, but the horror still clings to me like a shadow. I thought I had escaped last week, but the local authorities came to see me. They told me my mother and sister were both dead. I tried to tell them everything I knew about the scarecrows, the barn, the man with the pumpkin head. They looked at me like I was crazy. Of course they didn't believe me. They suspected it was me who had hurt them, but they had no evidence to prove it. When I asked about my other sister, they said there was no trace of her, as if she had simply vanished off the face of the earth. They said the search could take months, years, but they were doing everything they could. But I know better. I know where she is. She's in that cornfield, trapped in whatever darkness took my mother. I can still see her standing there on the edge of the rows, looking lost, looking empty. That haunts me knowing she's still out there. And whatever's possessed my mother has her now too. I don't know if we will ever see her again, but I know that whatever was out there that night is still out there, waiting, watching. And as long as I'm alive, I'll never be free of it. The only escape is death. Maybe if I end my own life, I can break free from this nightmare. Maybe I'd be giving in to whatever at once, but at least I won't have to be here to see it anymore. At least I won't have to live with the fear. I am so tired of being afraid. This was a suicide note found on Jimmy Brooks' person. Jimmy was a patient at Forest Lake Facility, diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. He had somehow escaped and convinced himself that his family was being tormented by scarecrows and strange figures in the cornfields. Tragically, every member of his family was brutally killed by him. The status of his sister, Martha Brooks, remains unknown. So which is true? I hope you sleep well and have a good night.